panelists. This is Steve Aaron, Virginia Scharf, and Steve Woodworth. So 2 Steves and a Virginia. I think my colleagues will agree with me that perhaps the only thing more difficult than doing an after-dinner talk is doing an after-lunch talk, especially on a beautiful Colorado day. So thank you all for being here. We hope we'll make it fun for you. You know, one of the things it strikes me that we've been talking about over the last day or so is how we talk about history. And really, history is not what happened in the past. History is the stories we tell about what happened in the past. And we heard one of the speakers this morning talk about the extraordinary impact that cowboy novels had on her as a young girl. But I think that probably the way that so many of you learned about the West was not from cowboy novels, and perhaps not even from Westerns, but it was from the textbooks that you encountered in high school and in college. And in those high school and college textbooks, it usually works something like this. A chapter on westward expansion, done. A chapter on the Civil War, where the West never appears. And a chapter on Reconstruction, where the West is a completely absent idea. So I thought we could start our roundtable this afternoon with a kind of lightning round in which I ask each of our speakers to say, wait a minute, what if you had to put all 3 of those stories together in one chapter? What would be the big themes that would emerge? And hopefully from these ideas that you all throw out in the beginning, we can find some ideas to dig a little bit deeper on as we go forward. So we'll just go in order. Steve Aaron.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to back one level up and return to one of the couple of themes that were also raised this morning, too, about the problem with textbooks. Mm-hmm. You know, we heard something about maps. Last night, actually, Bill Koch presented his map, and that's the sort of way textbooks always present maps. And again, they track along with those chapters. There's a textbook that gives us our westward expansion map that shows, you know, the United States in 1783 with its boundaries reaching the Mississippi River. And then there's the Louisiana Purchase reaching to the west, and then so forth, Oregon Country and Mexican Cession or something like that. It's all neatly demarcated. And this goes back to actually what Patty Limerick was talking about in terms of Drew Eisenberg's work on manifest destiny. The maps create this impression of a manifestly destined expansion of the United States. They erase all the contestation out of that. They erase the Indian presence. They treat these boundaries that the United States acquires, including in the Trans-Mississippi West, as if they're foreordained. They pretend that, for example, the Louisiana Purchase, which every textbook then monetizes as the United States spent $15 million, or the Mexican Cession, $15 million, as that's the end of the story. As opposed to, and there's a historian whose name Gingy and I disagree on, his name is Robert E. Lee.
No, his name is Bobby Lee. He invented the E for this, so, you know, he's going to print the legend, but go ahead. You know.
That's my line. In any case, he sort of has gone back and looked at the full accounting of these purchases. Obviously, what the Louisiana Purchase did, for example, is you take the territory from France. It doesn't clear the Indian titles. It costs much, much, much more money to conquer the territories, to acquire by purchase and treaty from Indian peoples. None of that ever gets into the textbooks. So the first thing I think we need to do is change the maps we have in our textbooks so that they don't treat these lands as if they're virgin lands. And then secondly, question what's in the textbooks in terms of some of the standard facts that get in there. It's at that point, it seems to me, that we can begin to tackle the issue of how do we bring the West more fully into the narrative of the Civil War, and perhaps even more importantly, how do we make sure that the West fits with the story of Reconstruction? And that's something I think we'll come back to, the way in which historians have increasingly thought in terms of Reconstruction as, again, to use a historian's name that was invoked this morning, as a greater Reconstruction, Elliot West's phrase, to think about the ways in which the nation as a whole was reconstructed, including the West, in the decades after the Civil War.
So I want to try to think about how we tell our stories about the past in terms of the 2 great streams of narrative of American history. One is a story of the sort of the expansion of liberty. So starting from the fact that our original document, our Constitution, acknowledged the existence of slavery, that's a place where that tension between slavery and liberty, slavery and freedom, slavery and citizenship is built into our national narrative. And then we have this other story that's been told as a separate story about Western expansion. And I think these are really one story. So it's not a story only of how slavery affects the course of American history. It can't really be told separately from the story of westward expansion. So there's a book out there, Empire and Liberty, that was a companion volume to an exhibition that I co-curated at the Autry Museum in LA. And this book really tries to tell the story of enslavement and freedom and the story of westward expansion as a single story with entwined threads. And I think once you understand that, then it raises these questions that I keep harping on every time I open my mouth here, it seems this weekend, about the kind of questions about who counts as an American, who counts as a citizen, where is the United States, how does the United States use its authority both to settle certain people and unsettle other people, to give certain people certain kinds of privileges and immunities and to deny them to other people who then pursue them as much as they can. And so I think that once we see these as two strands of the same American story, I think that's what Marnie was getting at from the beginning. I think it makes our history look a little different, and it will help us write that one chapter.
I think the Civil War made the West and westward expansion a more violent process than it would otherwise have been. That's not to say there was no violence, obviously, in the West before the Civil War or before the sectional crisis began to bleed out into the West, so to speak, no pun intended. But the Civil War made the West more violent. First you have Bleeding Kansas, which is sort of a frontier then during the 1850s to fight a battle over slavery and actually have a guerrilla war going on in Kansas. Then during the Civil War, yes, there are conventional military operations in the West like Sibley's New Mexico campaign and other campaigns, but you get a lot of guerrilla warfare in Missouri, and it gets really, really ugly. And you have Jesse James and his people kind of spinning off out of a guerrilla band led by a guy named Bill Quantrill, and really, I suppose today we'd probably throw around the word terrorist, which is maybe thrown around a bit too freely nowadays, but really, really some ugly things. And then post-Civil War, not only the continuance of crime in that way, but you've got a lot of people, 3 million men and a couple hundred women served in the Civil War armies and were exposed to a lot of violence. Remember, that was the bloodiest war in American history. About 750,000, give or take, soldiers died in that war. By comparison, World War II, 408,000 out of a population about more than four times as big. It's a very bloody war. People have experienced a lot of violence, and now they're out there in the West, and that can lead to violence all the way from the level of the individual who is maybe suffering from what we would today call PTSD, and is just not as stable as he would have been, et cetera, and may be quicker to resort to violence, all the way up to the level of the state, where you see that the U.S. government is more ready to use force more in a more wholesale basis than it was before the Civil War. You look at large Indian battles with the U.S. Army on the plains before the Civil War. They're not that large. Whereas after the Civil War, we get more aggressiveness. We get the generals who won the Civil War and knew how the guys who finally were the finishing first team for the Union, and they know how to use force, and they know how to use it ruthlessly when you need to get things done. And so they're prepared to do that on the plains. And their explanation would be, well, it needed to be done. Well, that's something that, of course, people are never going to stop debating. But anyway, I think that's one way that it changed the West and westward expansion during that era.
I think all of us have probably had the experience of people telling us that Western history is regional history. And I think all of us are up here arguing that Western history is national history. And we're looking for the ways we can change the narrative to persuade other people of that. So if I can just pick up on what I think each of you have just said in talking about how the U.S. acquired these vast tracts of land, how the U.S. decides who's a citizen, how the U.S. operates its military, et cetera, each of you is talking about really federal power here. And I wonder if we could just talk for a moment about how the federal government becomes a presence of real importance in the West during the Civil War and Reconstruction period, or however you want to expand that time period.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, that the way that the federal government plans to create a West that it can then occupy begins long before the Civil War. So we were talking over lunch about the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 1785, and 1787. And these are the kind of things that show up in a textbook, the kid memorizes them, and then you forget them for the rest of your life, right? But these are the blueprints that Jefferson and others lay out to try to organize potentially infinite incorporation of territories. So the Ordinance of 1785 creates this grid system for surveying and then selling off the public domain, selling off public land. So somebody in a land office in DC can sell or buy a piece of land in Wyoming or wherever that they haven't seen. They don't know what's on it. They don't know if it's a side of a cliff, if it's got water on it, anything like that. But somebody will buy it and then go out there and try and occupy it. No wonder the homesteaders fail in such enormous numbers, as Molly Gloss said. But the Ordinance of 1787 is also interesting because this was the ordinance that decreed that in the Northwest Territories, which is not Oregon, Washington, that kind of Northwest, but Wisconsin, Indiana, that Northwest part of the United States, that slavery would not be legal there. So you already have a contradiction in the Constitution that involves the West because the Constitution itself, with the Three-Fifths Compromise, recognizes the existence of enslavement and kind of legitimates it, but then these ordinances prohibit it in part of the territory. So there's going to be a struggle from that time onward about how is the federal government going to reckon with the presence of slavery where it is, that Steve was talking about this morning, and with the expansion of slavery in this potentially infinitely bounded area that the United States might occupy. So it goes back.
So it's I think, interesting, and again, to invoke, well, one line about the growth of the federal government often ties it to the Civil War. And sort of says it's in fighting the Civil War that the government has to, you know, take on new kind of capacities that it had never handled before. And certainly in terms of just fighting a total war and mobilizing the kind of manpower that other Steve, Steve 2, maybe Steve 1, sort of
2 is fine. I'll be 2.
brought forward.
Steve Prime.
That is, I think, you know, critical to it. And then just sort of then in the aftermath of the war, occupying the South and sort of administering that territory is certainly vital. But I think, and this goes back to Ned's, we prefer to attribute it to a historian, Richard White, but Ned corrects us that it's a political scientist who first coined the kindergarten of the American state idea around the American West. But I do think from the early republic forward, absent the West, the federal government is really an insignificant enterprise. I mean, most Americans in the early republic, you know, their only contact, if they didn't live out in the West and had dealings with the land office or with, you know, the army, which was principally a Western army to the extent it existed at all, their only contact with the federal government was the trip to the post office. It was really all that's their only connection. Some might want it returned that way, but that's a discussion for tomorrow, perhaps. But it does seem to me that it is in the West that in overseeing the administration and distribution of lands, in determining where slavery will be and won't be, in sort of pushing Indians off lands, that the federal government in the decades before the Civil War gains capacity, and certainly then after the Civil War, in administering territories and converting them into states in the decades after the Civil War, that again, the federal infrastructure just grows significantly and doesn't shrink back in the way that it might once the war-making effort had ended. during the Civil War.
I run into this discussion a lot, because a lot of people, I mean, well, the Civil War grew the state massively. Yes, but I'm going to say it shrank back an awful lot. You look at the size of the regular army, pre-Civil War, 16,000. Post-Civil War, 25,000 or thereabouts. So, and population is, of course, growing, so relatively little. It's true the government after the war, the federal government after the war is bigger than the federal government before the war, yes. And some of the propensities are there, some of the memory that, hey, when we need to, we can do this. But it shrinks an awful lot. So it does get bigger, but it's surprising how ephemeral that growth can be. But I think what you're saying also points up the degree to which, prior to the 20th century, the United States really was a union of states. And how much of the internal government action of the United States was carried out by the state that you lived in or state you happened to be in at the time. And then that's why the West becomes such a federal thing, because you don't yet have operating states there.
Well, at the moment, though, that the territorial system is most influential in the West, that is a time when federally appointed officials are going to be the ones who have more authority than they ever had before or since. So most of us are accustomed to electing our representatives. We elect our senators and our congresspeople and our governors. But during the territorial system, the governors are appointed by the federal government. So, for example, in Wyoming, right after the Civil War, there is a federally appointed governor, federally appointed Secretary of State for the territory of Wyoming, federally appointed marshal, so the chief law enforcement officer. These are all radical Republicans. They had been abolitionists before the war. They are Union veterans. They have a very, I would say left, a very, very liberal understanding of what kind of people ought to be admitted to citizenship and how they protect the rights of those people. So there's a race riot at the polls in 1868 in South Pass City, Wyoming, when some black citizens tried to vote. They were citizens by this time. Some white citizens tried to prevent these African-American men from voting. And the federal marshal comes right in there and enforces their right to vote. So this is a moment when the federal presence is really trying to create a kind of understanding about who belongs there.
So let me back up for just a few years and follow up on Steve's earlier point, because the federal government is making a lot of decisions about the West in lots of different ways. But there is a moment beginning in 1861 when the southern states secede from Congress to form the Confederacy. And I wonder if you can talk, if any of you can address what that means for the West. That is, there's a period of years where southern states don't get to help decide what's going to happen out West.
So you get all sorts of legislation in 1862 that has transforms the West and the nation in very dramatic ways. The Homestead Act, which has been spoken about, the Pacific Railway Act, which obviously we should talk about more here in terms of what railroads do. Those
Morrill Act.
The Morrill Act, the Land Grant Act for colleges, which again, the Western states would not be what they are without those universities and colleges. So those three, in the absence of Southern opposition that had thwarted that kind of political economy before the war, suddenly, those all pass. And they have an immense impact on what the West becomes.
Right. Railroads is a good point, because that is important both before and after. That contest about where are we going to build that federally subsidized transcontinental railroad. And you may have come across this in your reading before. There were people who said that its eastern terminus should be New Orleans, so it should follow roughly the route of I-10 to the West Coast. And there were some who said its eastern terminus should be Vicksburg. Not surprisingly, one person who thought the eastern terminus of that railroad should be Vicksburg was Franklin Pierce's Secretary of War, 1853 to 1857, who was a guy named Jefferson Davis. It had a plantation about 20 miles from Vicksburg. Imagine that. And he was really the power behind the throne in the Pierce administration. So you have the Gadsden Purchase, 1853, clearing land titles as per Mexico. And I don't know who else was, in the game there, but at least as to Mexico, you've got the Gadsden Purchase, and the reason for that in 1853 was to secure the valley of the Gila River for that potential southern route transcontinental railroad. It's kind of interesting. I was reading the journal of an officer in Stephen Watts Kearny's army that was going out to California during the Mexican War through the Gila River Valley. And it was interesting, as he wrote, if they ever build a railroad to California, it's not going to be through this valley. This is awful. But anyway, that's why they bought the Gadsden Purchase. That was 53. And then you've got 1854. You've got sort of the upper Midwest or the old Northwest answers back. And its answer is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen Douglas, who owns a lot of property in Chicago. And where will the railroad through Nebraska have its eastern terminus? That would be Chicago, and that would benefit Stephen Douglas. So it almost looks venal, but I think they're playing for their team in that sense. But so you've got this back and forth tug of war where we're going to buy the Gadsden Purchase so the Gila River route will look good. And oh no, we're going to organize the Nebraska Territory so we can subsidize that railroad with the land grants as it goes across the Great Plains.
But if you think, too, about this as a kind of spatial enterprise, right? So the government in Washington, D.C., imagine the government in Washington, D.C. trying to exert its authority in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming, right, in the 1860s. And what you need is to have spatial control of enough, be able to get people out there as quickly as possible. So building a transcontinental railroad and creating greater paths of transportation and bringing the Army out to patrol and to secure first the right-of-way and then, sort of territories around, and then getting settlers out there as much as possible. But then so the Homestead Act is intended to try to create these little nodes of American power all over the West. The railroad creates the routes for them, and then something like the Morrill Act, which is always an afterthought when we talk about the big legislation of 1862. That creates these little centers of state authority that do things like tell people what to grow and how to grow it. Think about it, the ag extension agents, who become very, very important sort of representatives of government power when they're doing everything from canning clubs with people in the countryside and small towns, to ag extension agents with their bulletins talking about, we had a lot of grasshoppers this year, and this is how we deal with it. And if you start thinking about that kind of everyday life, or you think about creating public school systems from the very beginning, the Northwest Ordinances created school sections. So there were sections 16 and 36 were the two sections that were going to be devoted to public education. This is a way of kind of spatializing government control and creating a nation out of very, very far-flung and very remote places.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the territory system, since you brought it up, and you've sort of, in a sense, in invoking Jefferson's genius, in a way, and the way in which it sets up a blueprint that sort of works across the country and sets up some good outcomes. And then sort of you were arguing, I think, also how the territorial system allows sort of democratization to advance in ways that democracy might not have allowed it.
Right.
Meaning that so long as these were appointed offices in some ways, these officials could kind of work to protect votes for African Americans or give votes to women,
right,
in ways that didn't happen in other places, in ways that maybe the local populace left to its own devices might not have been so generous in supporting those voting rights. On the other side of it, though, is the standard textbook treatment of the territorial period, which sees it as not fulfilling democratic promise. It's sort of these federally appointed hacks who are going out mostly and sort of plundering. It's the line would be from the blundering generation before the Civil War to the plundering generation after the Civil War. The Gilded Age, notable mostly for its corruption and territorial officials who work with sort of fee-based systems, which give them every incentive to sort of, in one way or another, cheat the system to make money.
Right.
So there's all sorts of flaws in the system, and yet, before we get to the two states part of this title of this equation, there is, I think, a defense to be made of the territorial system in the sense that it did have some better outcomes.
I think mixed outcomes.
Mixed outcomes.
Mixed
There's- yeah,
outcomes,
okay.
yeah.
So I wonder if we can turn to for a moment to Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, as you all know, is that period after the Civil War when the federal government steps in and attempts to reconstruct the divided country and to bring the freedmen, the formerly enslaved people, back into the country, to the body politic. And 3 extraordinary amendments are passed right after the Civil War. They free the slaves, constitutional amendments, free the slaves. They make all native-born people in the United States of America citizens of the United States, with a very important exception, the Indians, or Indians not taxed, as they said. And they give these newly freed black men the right to vote. So one thing that's always puzzled me is how do we reconcile the fact that there are these very, really progressive changes in American politics going on at the very moment that the Indian Wars are going on and Indian peoples are being pushed onto reservations and they're not being granted the birthright citizenship that these other excluded Americans have had. How do we put those 2 stories together?
I think we put them together in a picture of a government that intends to control land that it does not yet control, okay? And also citizens and settlers, wannabe settlers and actual settlers who have in mind settling themselves and unsettling others. So we really need to think in terms of Native peoples, indigenous peoples are not being understood to have the same standing with the United States that people who are acting on behalf of American control have. So this politics of contestation and resistance, there is an expansion of citizenship, but let's also remember that the 14th Amendment, offering privileges and immunities of citizenship to all native-born people, not excluding Indians not taxed. Susan B. Anthony in 1872 went to try to vote in Upper New York State on the basis of the 14th Amendment. I am a native-born person. I should be able to practice the privileges and immunities of citizenship. That should include being able to use the franchise, that is a privilege of citizenship. And she was denied the right to vote, sued, and lost. So, you know, none of these things, all of these things are subject to adjudication in the courts, and all of these freedoms are tremendously fragile freedoms. We may say we see this as a story of expanding freedoms. I think we have to realize that everything that's been fought for can always be lost and need to be fought for again.
I'd comment, you know, someone said, and it might have been my dad sometime when I was getting too riled up about something that wasn't right. And he said, never attribute to malice what can be accounted for by ignorance. And sometimes ignorance winds up being just somebody believing something different than I do. There are a lot of ignorant people like that in the world, I find that there are. But, you know, if you start with certain assumptions, well, certainly if you start with our assumptions, their behavior makes no sense at all. But if you start, for example, with the assumption that that the Plains Indians are not entitled to continue to hold their land as they had. In other words, to nomadic and migrate around through the public domain of most of the Great Plains or whatever. If you started with that assumption, then it would be possible for people relatively easily to, you know, there wouldn't be that much of a problem to square. This makes sense to them. So it comes down, I think, to what people believed. If they believed differently, they would act differently. I think also, oh yeah, I think I'll wind it up.
So look, Reconstruction, and I started with my lightning round remark about greater Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a pretty complicated thing, and it's pretty paradoxical, as your leading question opened there. It's more complicated and more paradoxical when the West becomes part of the equation. You know, to the extent that Reconstruction is about establishing the supremacy of the federal government and reordering the racial order to allow for African American voting and some degrees of citizenship rights being expanded and extended, that's a complicated equation, and it brings forward a lot of very troubling issues that play out over the next decades after the Civil War, and in some ways continue to play out to the present. when you bring the West into that equation, when you bring the West into that framework, when you consider it as a sort of greater Reconstruction project, it becomes that much more complicated and that much more paradoxical in its impact in terms of whose freedoms, whose losses. That, this is an era in which it's not just a biracial order that needs to be resorted out, but especially in places like California, where do you fit the Chinese in this scheme? Where do people of Mexican ancestry who had been guaranteed their citizenship rights under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where do they figure now in terms of how these are going to play out? Where do Indians figure? Why is it that, that you have then even African-American regiments fighting against Indians, in a sense, newly emancipated African-Americans participating in the wars that are ending the freedoms in many ways of Indian peoples? It is an era in which things get pretty messy. And unfortunately, the West is a messy place.
Well, that brings up, I think, a really interesting point. I mean, I think all of us have heard that the nadir of American race relations, the emergence of Jim Crow, really begins in the 1890s, say. But let's talk about what the West taught the rest of the United States about racial laws. Because I think you're right, Steve. There's examples with Indians, with Chinese, with Mexicans.
Yes. I'll just say yes to that. I do want to make sure that we get some time for questions.
We have just a few more minutes for this. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Others.
Okay. All right. To me, of those different classes, as far as looking back and knowing what should they have done. Yeah, Chinese, that's pretty clear how, you treat them as citizens or naturalize them and so forth. Mexicans, persons of Mexican descent, that's very clear. It's settled by treaty, as you say. The question comes with Indians. How do you cope with that? Do they want citizenship? Is that something that they would desire? And so I've sometimes, as I've looked back on this era, just come up with what do you do about this? How would you deal with it? Anybody?
We have 30 seconds for your reply here, Steve.
Well,
wow.
I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer on the part of the Indian peoples of the United States.
No, but you want to speak to the racial question.
But I think on the racial question, in terms of just the complications about, how do you sort out a hierarchy that, again, you have certain legal obligations and codes, but those get, those get thrown away pretty quickly. The property rights that Mexicans had been guaranteed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they kind of fall away pretty quickly in places like California in the decades after the Civil War. The rights of free blacks. States like Oregon and California are working pretty hard not to allow free blacks in at various points. So, that's already in the equation before the Civil War and continues after, where places like California aren't very quick to ratify the 14th Amendment. So I think, none of which, and again, to go back to the larger question too, when people, again, our standard textbooks, when the West isn't in, when the West is left separated, the standard textbooks say immigration restriction in the United States begins in the 1920s with those, with those national origin acts in 1921 and 24 that change who can get into the United States, and it's directed against Southern and Eastern Europeans from getting into the United States in the numbers they had come. Conveniently forgotten is the way in which anti-Chinese sentiment had triggered the Exclusion Act in 1882 and other anti-Asian edicts earlier again. When the West gets left out or gets segregated in our textbooks instead of being integrated in the way that your opening question started, we don't get a very accurate national history.
Well, we can all be proud that the West had a lot to teach our nation about race relations.
For better or worse.
Yeah, eye rolling. Okay, let's take questions from the audience here. Yeah, right here in the front. Just wait for the
we need to
microphone
get the mic.
if you don't mind.
It's on your way.
Here you go.
What about the role of blacks? I'm talking about after the war and when the people were freed, about the role of blacks in settling the West. And, just as you pointed out, history in schools, totally whitewashed, basically. in a way that, doesn't bring out the richness of the history. So, and I just want to add one thing regarding the role of the black. I happened to be in San Francisco. This is several years ago. I'm on a bus, and they were having a lesson, I guess, on history of the West. And so one of the placards from the bus fell into my lap. And it had a picture of black cowboys. And I said, wow, I didn't even know there were black cowboys. And I still have that placard. I kept it.
So I could tell one story about that, about a woman named Biddy Mason, who was a woman who was enslaved, brought to the West, enslaved by a Mormon doctor. And he took her to Utah, where slavery was legal in Utah territory. And then they went to California, where slavery was not legal. And she sued to gain her freedom in California. And in 1854, the courts declared that because she had been taken to a free state, that she would be free, so that she was able to live as a free woman, establish a business, leave a mark on the community of Los Angeles, become somebody who's become a pretty well-known figure in California history. And this is a couple of years before Dred Scott. So it's always been kind of puzzling to me that the Tawny courts never took into account any of this stuff having to do with Biddy Mason and her successful suit for freedom when they decided the Dred Scott case, which made slavery legal throughout American territory. So that's a moment when sort of the eliding of what's going on in the West really did, I think, have an impact on American history in a kind of absent way.
Do either of you want to weigh in on the African-American
Well,
presence?
so one thing would be, and this is sort of interesting, again, now I don't want to suggest that the people in this audience are not of high school age, or have been maybe a few years since they were of high school and college age. But, I'm trying to think in terms of the current run of, because I do a lot of work with K through 12 education and the ways in which the current run of textbooks, what they do say. Do they give a sentence about Buffalo Soldiers? Maybe, and the sort of role of African-American regiments in the Indian Wars after the Civil War? Maybe. Do they give a sentence about exodusters, the people leaving the South to move to Kansas, free blacks looking to sort of stake anew in Kansas, and with all the rich symbolism that Kansas held for them? Maybe a sentence there. And do they sort of say something about the multi-ethnic composition of most cowboy bands? I don't know. Did they? Do they?
Yeah.
Probably
Right.
not. But those are probably the only three ways that even then come in.
It with the green necklace back over here. Just wait for the mic, please.
Two thoughts. One is there a way that you could bring this on the road? This is so interesting, what all you're teaching, that it would be a pity to stop it after the Institute here. But I'm sitting here sort of shocked that what seemed like distant history is yesterday. And I don't know if it's because I'm getting older as we speak, or that my grandfather, I think, was born in 1865 or something. But what seemed like centuries ago is absolutely hardly even yesterday. Are you surprised when you... Do you feel that too?
Well, I think in some ways our history seems ever more alive to us as the things we take for granted seem contested. So right now, I think we're living through a time when I had a conversation with an editor about a book. He wanted me to write a book for the 2020 centennial of women's suffrage in the United States from the point of view of the West, right? Because the West emancipates women first. Well, the first women to get the vote in the United States are in 1869 in Wyoming Territory, and that's a long, long story that involves all these multi-ethnic kind of settlement issues that we've been talking about. And then various other Western territories and states, most of them adopt some form of women's suffrage or another long before the East does. And so we thought about that and wondered about it. So I had a conversation with him about this first in about 2014. And then I had another conversation with him just last year about it. And I'm like, well, things look a little different right now. Because we've taken sort of the march of women's rights ever forward and in a more, kind of an expanding way for granted. But a lot of the things that, my generation of the 60s and 70s and 80s fought for, we're now seeing these are highly contested things, whether it's everything from reproductive rights to equal pay to a variety of other kinds of things, family leave, whatever. If you see it from that point of view, they look much more like fragile freedoms. And so I think, this history seems alive to us today because we understand that nothing is ever over. History just keeps on happening.
So just to give one specific example, Gingy and I have worked together for many years at the Autry Museum, as we mentioned. We've sort of been on the road in this way for a while. But one of the exhibitions, she mentioned it earlier, and we have the exhibition companion volume out there, the Empire and Liberty volume that she mentioned, that came out of that one of the books that came out of that exhibition. And one of the things we were really wrestling with in that exhibition was where to end it. Where does the Civil War in the West end? And we sort of, well, 1865, well, no, that didn't work. And then we said, well, Reconstruction, and one conventional ending date for Reconstruction is 1877. But that really doesn't make sense from a Western perspective. There's lots of all those issues that I talked about as being central to Reconstruction aren't settled in 1877 by any means across the nation, but certainly not in the American West. And then we sort of kept extending outward. And I think in the grandest tradition of museum curation, what did we do, Gingy?
We ended up with the timeline.
Which just had question marks to the end, because we couldn't actually figure out. But I think that actually speaks to your question exactly.
Maybe we can wind it up next year.
These questions have been by no means resolved. In fact, they seem ever more with us now. And they seem ever more troubling now, or as troubling now as they were 100 and something years ago.
And I think one of the big issues under attack right now, of course, as all of you know, is birthright citizenship. We thought that was resolved forever with the 14th Amendment, but it wasn't. I think we have time for one more question, right over here.
Could you tell me what was the position of the Mormon Church towards the Native Americans and for the Black?
Oh, wow, we're going to do that in the last minute?
Lightning round, lightning round.
Sorry.
Oh.
Well, one of the reasons why the Mormons get thrown out of Missouri in the 1830s, in part because they're seen as being too friendly to the Indians, or too in league with the Indians potentially. But that's to go back even before they get out to Utah territory, to Deseret.
And I mean, I think what you have to say is, with any question like that, it depends on when you're asking that question, because the leadership of the Mormon Church has taken different positions over time with regard to who can join, who will go to heaven, what kind of rights anybody has. And so I think, what we need here is a really good Mormon historian to tell you decade by decade how those things change. And we've seen them change over time.
One in the back there.
Where?
No, he's.
I don't see it.
Yeah.
Oh, Sheldon, we have 1 minute left, so
I'll
make
be
it
quick
short
on
and
this.
sweet.
He's going to
Actually,
answer all these questions.
Really quick on this, actually my mom, funny, I'm the intersection of this. My mom's actually Mormon pioneer that came across the plains. My dad's Cheyenne, grew up on the reservation. And so, but if you look at 1854, I think, on the Utah territorial floor, Brigham Young, who's the territorial governor, also declares Indian slavery, so that you can't hold black slaves and you could hold Indian slaves in Utah territory. There's different requirements, and it's kind of interesting to look at that nuance of the different requirements to hold black slaves versus Indian slaves. But part of the Mormon cosmology, of course, is that Indians have to, well, it's paternalistic. So Mormons believe that they have to save Indians and lift them up in order for the Mormon Jesus to come back and for us to live in utopia again. And so not to denigrate that doctrine or philosophy at all, but that's the Mormon idea, is that there's somehow a connection to Indians rising up and becoming leaders and becoming assimilated, essentially, is what it is. And it's coming from a paternalistic perspective. So if that's as close as I could get.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
always great when you can crowdsource answers.
Yeah, really.
So please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful